I'm delighted to welcome Kieran Setiya for the Long Now Boston Conversation series. Kieran, hello and welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
This is a fantastic topic. Long-termism is become very well. It's got a certain reputation that's been built quite recently. The movement was articulated in William McCaskill's book, What We Owe the Future. That's been getting a lot of attention and funding, as has the effective altruism movement founded by McCaskill. But the real media kicker was the spectacular collapse last month of cryptocurrency exchange FTX and its founder, Sam Bankman-Fried, a celebrated funder of effective altruism. There's a lot of hyperbole flying around. Our goal tonight, with Kieran's help, is to step back from the frenzy and look at the foundational premises of long-termism and what long-termism stands for. What are the long-term implications of this philosophy? But first, I want to talk about Kieran's new book, just released last month, Life is Hard, How Philosophy Can Help Us Find Our Way. And you can see it in my screen. This is really a fantastic book. I had a wonderful time reading it. It's not a typical book of philosophy. It's a rich, personal, thoughtful, and accessible work. And I recommend it to everyone that's trying to make sense of life. So to commemorate Kieran's book, we are offering a hard copy as a door prize tonight to the first person who can correctly answer one question from the book. Please write your answers in the chat and Mary will help us pick the winner. So here's the question. The first correct answer in the chat wins the book. What famous philosopher said, quote, "Man is a political animal"? All right, I'm sure some of you probably know the answer. This is one of the little tidbits from Kieran's book. And so what do we think? Has anybody volunteered an answer yet?
Well, answer's in there, but I don't know what the answer is. So.
Oh, we have a positive answer. Actually, it's the first one, Michael Cates. Congratulations. The answer is Aristotle. So we have a winner. We have a book. Mary will collect the information. We'll get that book out to you. And now we are ready to go on to the main event. Right. So Kieran Setiya is a philosophy section head in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT. He works on issues in ethics, epistemology, and the philosophy of mind, and is the author of a number of books, including Knowing Right from Wrong, Midlife, A Philosophical Guide, and his new book, Life is Hard, How Philosophy Can Help Us Find Our Way. Professor Setiya published a book review, The New Moral Mathematics, in Boston Review, commenting on the philosophical consequences of long-termism, as articulated by William McCaskill in What We Owe the Future. So that was how our conversation with Professor Setiya got started. And with that, I'd like to bring Kieran to the podium and have him give us his presentation. Kieran, welcome.
Thank you very much, George. It's good to be here. I'm going to share my screen, and this was working very well when we practiced it. So it's probably going to go wrong this time. Let's see what happens. There we go. I think it's working. So I'm going to start with the question, what is long-termism, in the sense in which it's recently been an object of media attention. So the term was coined by Will McCaskill and Toby Ord a few years ago for the view that having a positive influence on the long-term future is a key moral priority of our time. And when you put it that way, you might think, who would deny it? So here's McCaskill from What We Owe the Future. Future people count. There could be a lot of them. We can make their lives go better. This is the case for long-termism in a nutshell. The premises are simple, and I don't think they're particularly controversial, yet taking them seriously amounts to a moral revolution. Well, does it? That depends a lot on what exactly we mean by positive influence when we talk about having a positive influence on the long-term future, and on how much weight we should give to this particular moral priority in comparison with others. For instance, you might ask, should we be giving more priority to the long-term future than we currently are? If so, how much more? And one of the features of McCaskill's book that is, I think, strategic but a little frustrating is that he doesn't want to answer those questions in it. He doesn't want to take them up. So we're left not really clear how strong a claim long-termism is. Now, in his academic work, McCaskill advocates what he calls strong long-termism, that having a positive influence on the long-term future is the key moral priority of our time, which is still a little bit vague, but nevertheless evidently stronger than saying it's just one of the things that matters. Until we get clear on exactly how much the long-term future matters, according to this form of long-termism, we don't really know what we're talking about. So here's what I'm going to try to do today. I'm going to trace one form of long-termism, the form that McCaskill is propounding, back to effective altruism, another movement he's been involved in, and back to the roots of effective altruism in what gets called the principle of utility. I'm going to say something about the radical implications of this version of long-termism, what it actually tells us. I'm going to say something about where I think it goes wrong. I'm going to raise some objections to it. And at the end, I'm going to briefly sketch an alternative view of how we should think ethically about the long-term future. So we're going to start with these guys in 18th, 19th century Britain and the moral theory known as utilitarianism. So on the left, we've got Jeremy Bentham. On the right, his student, John Stuart Mill. Mill wrote a book called Utilitarianism, in which he said actions are right in proportion as they tend to produce happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness, or in the principle of utility, generalizing from happiness to welfare or well-being in general, the thought is we should always act so as to produce the greatest aggregate welfare. Now, utilitarians like Mill were moral reformers. So they argued for universal suffrage, prison reform, aid to the poor, better treatment of animals, and they made progress towards those goals. They were, in a way, the effective altruists of their time. But as was recognized early on, the principle of utility or utilitarianism, if you don't qualify it, has apparently disturbing implications. So here are the two primary things that people find disturbing about the principle of utility. One is that it implies that you should give as much weight to the welfare of strangers as you do to your own or that of people you love. You're just taking everyone's welfare and aggregating it. You can't give special attention to your loved ones or to yourself. There's a way in which, at the fundamental ethical level, utilitarians advocate an almost complete self-denial. The second implication of utilitarianism is maybe even more disturbing, which is that you should act to produce the greatest aggregate welfare, whatever the means you have to take, whatever the most effective means are. So it's not just that if you could save 100 lives or 1,000 lives, you should save 1,000. It's that if you could save 1,000 lives by murdering 100 people, then other things equal, according to utilitarianism, the principle of utility, you should. Now, other things may not be equal very often. There may be other kinds of bad effects of rampantly murdering people in that way, but those are, as it were, technicalities. In principle, if you could get away with it, you should. So for both of those reasons, utilitarianism is not a common sense view. It's a radical, revisionary, minority position in moral philosophy. Okay, enter these guys, the effective altruists. So effective altruism, founded by McCaskill and Ord about 20 years ago, is both a social movement and a philosophical position. It's bankrolled nowadays both by grassroots contributions and by billionaires. And a good way to think about effective altruism is that it's utilitarianism, the principle of utility, minus the harsh rejection of partiality and the rejection of respect for people's rights. So the slogan here is effective altruism is what you get when you start out with utilitarianism and say, well, that can't be right because we're allowed to give more weight to our own welfare and the welfare of people we love. And we shouldn't produce the aggregate welfare by violating people's rights. The effective altruist thought is, even if you make those amendments, you still have something substantive. The picture is one on which altruism isn't the whole of morality, but it's part. We should devote at least some of our time and money and energy to maximizing aggregate welfare. Maybe not all of it. We're allowed partiality to ourselves and those we love. And we should do it provided that we can maximize aggregate welfare without violating rights. So for instance, giving to effective charities seems like a way to devote some time and money to producing more welfare, doesn't violate anyone's rights, at least in any obvious way. And it's consistent with still having enough left that you can have a decent life yourself and support those you love. Effective altruists sometimes make this more concrete by using a thought experiment due to Peter Singer, which is the drowning child thought experiment. So some of you will be familiar with this. The idea is you're walking past a pond, there's a child drowning in it, you're wearing your new $1,000 suit. Should you wade in to save the child, ruining your $1,000 suit? Of course you should. This is what Singer calls the weak principle of beneficence. If you can prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything of moral significance, you must. And his thought is that geographical proximity is irrelevant here. It's not just that you should save the drowning child in front of you. It's that you should do what you can to save, as it were, drowning children around the world. Effective altruists often suggest a tithe of, say, 10%, assigning that proportion of your income to the most effective charities, rated by measures like quality adjusted life years saved. So the idea is that we can rate charities by how effectively they save lives per dollar, and mosquito nets and malaria medicines do really well. Those are the charities we should give to. Now, how do we get from effective altruism in this form to long-termism? The key thought is that just as geographical or spatial proximity is morally irrelevant, so is temporal proximity. Future people matter just as much as people living now, and there may be many more of them. In fact, that's something of an understatement. So there are now about 8 billion of us, roughly 15% of all humans who've ever lived. If we survive for another million years, which is the longevity of a typical mammalian species, at even a tenth of our current population, there'll be 8 trillion more of us, meaning that we'll be outnumbered by future people on a scale of 1,000 to 1. And in fact, that could be vastly more if, as some effective altruist long-termists urge, we pour lots of money and energy into colonizing space. Now, the real kicker is what happens if we factor in uncertainty using the tools of expected value theory. So we look at outcomes that would have enormous value that we have a tiny chance of affecting, and then we do the math. We sort of discount by probability. And what we find is that, for instance, if you could save 1 million lives today, or shave just 0.0001% off the probability of imminent human extinction, that's to say a 1 in a million chance of saving, let's say, 8 trillion lives, then the value in terms of expected aggregate welfare of reducing the probability of extinction by that tiny amount is greater than the expected aggregate welfare of saving 1 million lives. So you should devote if you had to choose, you should go with the minute reduction of risk, allowing 1 million people to die. And this doesn't depend on utilitarianism as such. The math will apply so long as, even if you agree that we can't promote aggregate welfare in ways that violate people's rights, and you agree that we should only devote 10% of our resources to doing so, we're kind of limited altruists, if we're measuring altruistic impact by aggregate welfare, and we're factoring in probability by discounting in the obvious way, we're going to get these kinds of results. So this is one way to think about what having a positive impact on the future would be, or what having a positive influence would be. And this is the one that is currently captivating attention through the work of people like Will MacAskill. So what exactly are the implications of thinking about our obligations to the future in this way? That's going to depend on details that I'll get to in a moment, but I'm going to start to bring out what's radical about the view and maybe elicit some discomfort with it by going back to that drowning child in the pond. Now, the idea that you should save the child seems morally compelling, and the suggestion that you should save drowning children, as it were, all around the world seems like an inspiring ideal, at least at first. But what does the effective altruist actually say about this case? So imagine that you walk by the drowning child on your way to sell your suit and donate the proceeds to a highly effective charity. And you figure you could calculate, you could save more lives, more expected aggregate well-being will be achieved by letting this one child drown, walking to the donation center, selling your suit, and writing the check. Effective altruism suggests that other things equal, and they may not be equal, but if you could get away with it and no one would know, you should. I think when you think of the implications of effective altruism in that way, they're a little more surprising and a little more radical than they initially seem when we motivate them with examples like this. Now, long-termism, in effect, says something similar about drowning children now, people in need now, in relation to the further future. And, sorry, I'm going to wait a second for that slide. The idea is that if you could make a huge difference in the further future, as it were, saving those drowning people far away, and the cost will be that drowning people here and now have to die, you should. And that's what underlies one of the more disturbing aspects of effective altruist long-termism, which is upfront in MacAskill's book, which is the way in which he's inclined to downplay the importance of nuclear war and climate change, because the studies he's consulted suggest that we would survive them. Millions or even billions would die in the short term, perhaps, but the future trillions would be safe. So here's some highlighted web pages from the 80,000 Hours Effective Altruist website. Why climate change almost definitely won't directly cause human extinction. And at the bottom highlighted, they think it'll have less than 1 in a million chance that it will do that. Now, we can come back later to whether the evidence behind this is actually sound. But my main point is that this is the implication of thinking about the future in the way that effective altruist long-termists do. And in fact, there's a particular feature of MacAskill's thinking inherited from utilitarianism that underlies the most radical implications of long-termism for the future. This is his rejection of what has been called the intuition of neutrality. So this is a slogan due to the philosopher, the moral philosopher Jan Narveson, who said, we're in favor of making people happy, but we're neutral about making happy people. So what does he mean by that? Here's a way to sort of get your head into this way of thinking. The thought is, you can see it at large scale and small scale. So at large scale, the thought would be, suppose you're told humanity is going to go extinct eventually, say in 10,000 years, but everyone who lives between now and then is going to have a pretty good life. How important is it that the average population per year is closer to 2 billion than 1 billion? The intuition of neutrality says not very important, not really important at all. What matters is quality, not quantity, when it comes to human lives. Or take an example much closer to home. Suppose you're deciding whether to have a child, and you think, well, I expect that if I had a child, they'd have a good enough life. That's my life situation. Does it follow that unless you can come up with some countervailing reason not to have a child that's sufficiently strong, you have to conclude that it will be better to have a child, because after all, we should be making happy people. According to the intuition of neutrality, the answer is no. In itself, adding an extra life to the world isn't better or worse than not doing so. It's entirely up to you whether to make that decision. Now, if the intuition of neutrality is right, future people still matter, but what matters primarily is not ensuring that they exist in ever greater numbers. It's not harming them by causing them to die prematurely or painfully, or by leaving them a depleted, dangerous world. Now, the key feature of McCaskill's approach, as I said, shared with utilitarianism, is that he does neutrality. He adopts what's called a total view, on which the value of the future is a function of total aggregate welfare. He shares that with utilitarianism. And that's why existential risk looms so large, because it's not just about the suffering of people dying. It's about the extra lives that will be prevented from existing. If you deny neutrality and accept the total view, you're going to think that a world in which we have trillions of descendants living decent lives is vastly, vastly better than a world in which humanity goes extinct in 1,000 years. In fact, what you end up with is, and McCaskill is upfront about this too, a moral case for space settlement. Because if we settle other planets, other galaxies, he estimates the future population might be not just 10 to the 13, but maybe 10 to the 45. And at that point, the numbers absolutely dwarf the significance of what happens to us in the next 100 or even 1,000 years. Now, you may think that a moral case for space settlement is radical enough. In fact, the implications of denying neutrality and accepting the total view are associated with something called by the imaginative philosophers the repugnant conclusion. So the idea here is that, in general, on this way of evaluating human lives, a world in which 10 to the 45 of us have lives only just worth living turns out to be better in terms of aggregate welfare than a future in which we flourished for centuries on Earth in modest numbers. Here's the comparison. So imagine the worst life you could have without wishing you'd never been born. So just worth living. You're glad you're alive, but it's pretty bad. And now imagine the kind of life you dream of living. For McCaskill, and those who, like him, accept the repugnant conclusion, a future in which 10 to the 45 of us colonize planets to live lives that are just worth living is better than a future in which we survive on Earth in, 1 billion at a time, living wonderful lives. Okay, so those are some of the more radical implications of thinking about the long-term future in the way that effective altruists tend to do. Where exactly do they go wrong? So it's one thing to say, look, effective altruism has some very alarming consequences I at least find alarming. It's another to say where the arguments for it fail. Now, one thing we could do here is go back and focus on the intuition of neutrality. And McCaskill does spend time on this. He gives arguments against the intuition of neutrality and in favor of this aggregate welfare total view. I don't think the arguments work, but they take us pretty deep into the weeds of population ethics. They're pretty technical. I think one thing we can say without any controversy, just on the next slide, is that these arguments are highly controversial. So they turn on paradoxical seeming arguments in population ethics. Arguing for the total view and rejecting neutrality is a very far cry from the simple premise that future people matter as much as we do, that say scattering, this is another example McCaskill often gives, that scattering broken glass is wrong, whether it harms someone tomorrow or in 100 years' time. Maybe so, but that doesn't commit us in any way to the idea that it's deeply important to bring about future people, bring more future people into existence and that the numbers really matter. So if we insist on neutrality, existential risk is going to look much less important than it does to effective altruists like McCaskill. And the moral case for space settlement is not going to look so strong. There's an objection that people often make to long-termism that I'm going to go by rather briefly. People often say, look, long-termism rests on something impossible, namely predicting in any detail what the further future will be like. This is tricky. There's a standard answer to this, which is, look, it's true that we can't predict the further future with any confidence. But look, so long as we can assign tentative probabilities or even place those probabilities in orders of magnitude, we can do the kind of coarse-grained applications of expected value theory that effective altruists do. And we're still going to be pushed to these conclusions that say existential risk is much more important than short-term life-saving. Climate change is much less important than it may seem to be. Space settlement is much more important. I'm not going to spend much time on this for two reasons. And the two reasons are, one is that actually no one really knows, I think, how to do the math except by assuming the total view of aggregate welfare. And I think the total view is wrong. Once you reject it, it's very hard to figure out how to sort of run these expected value calculations. Too bad. The truth is sometimes very complicated. The second reason I want to set this aside is that the feature of expected value theory that supports EA, effective altruist long-termism, this feature that astronomically small probabilities of superlative outcomes sort of swamp the calculations, is widely regarded by people who work on expected value theory as a bug, not a feature. That's to say, it's regarded as a problem for expected value theory, that if the outcome is good enough, even the minutest probability of it can completely swamp all of our decision making. And there's a technical industry of trying to figure out how to reformulate expected value theory so as to avoid that implication. For both of those reasons, I think getting into the details of this is not going to be very productive. What I think is going to be more useful is to focus on effective altruism, which is really the source of this new long-termist movement, and think about the defects of effective altruism. And the basic problem is this. The fundamental issue with effective altruism is that it doesn't grapple with injustice. This is in the name. I mean, effective altruism is a theory of altruism or charity or philanthropy. It's not a theory of justice. It's a theory about how to spend your money and time as an individual, not a theory about how society should be organized or transformed. And the neglect of injustice creates several problems for effective altruism and the associated long-termism. I'm going to mention three. So first problem, when you adopt the kind of scale that effective altruists often do of quality adjusted life years, what you're doing is in effect discounting years of life impaired by disability, giving them less weight in your calculations. To do that in public policy or charitable giving is in effect to treat the lives of disabled people as less worth saving than the lives of the able-bodied. So there's a problem of injustice in often the fundamental way in which outcomes are evaluated by effective altruists. This is part of a much larger problem about the difficulty of finding a common currency in which to measure how good outcomes are, given the plurality of values. Pithy quote from one of my heroes, John Berger: "How does the cure of a serious illness compare in value with one of the better poems of a minor poet?" I don't think the effective altruists have any credible answer to that question, and they just wish it away. Second big problem is that effective altruists tend to ignore politics. Here's why that might matter. In doing so, they ignore the political structures that divide and organize moral labor. So imagine a kind of simplified, very simplified picture. Imagine it's like this. Imagine we carve the world up into nation states precisely in order to discharge our altruistic obligations more efficiently. So imagine we set things up so that each state is responsible altruistically for the well-being of its own citizens. If we set things up that way, it would then be double counting to make citizens of one country take up the slack when another government fails to do its job. We already assigned the responsibilities in this distributed way. Now, that doesn't mean we should do nothing, but our individual obligations would be limited in that circumstance, and they might have more to do with political reform than direct intervention. Now, objection, the real world isn't like that. We didn't, in fact, set up the world to divide altruistic labor by nation state. The history of nation states and their altruistic roles is much more complicated. I'm not denying that for a moment. That's quite true. The point is, there's just no way to assess the scale of our actual individual obligations or how we should respond to them without asking in detail, how does that distribution of labor hypothesis differ from reality, which it surely does. And in order to do that, we're going to have to address questions about global politics that effective altruists largely or almost entirely neglect. So that's the second problem. The third problem is, in a way, the worst and the easiest to get your head around. The third problem with effective altruism's neglect of justice is that much of the harm we see in the world is harm that is collectively caused. So when we look at drought or famine in post-colonial countries, we can't just ignore the history of colonial exploitation. And when we look at climate change, we can't ignore its human causes, disproportionately caused by those in Europe and the West, nor can we ignore the fact that its harms will disproportionately burden those who are least responsible for it. And the key thing here is that addressing the harms that we are collectively causing, or that we have collectively caused, is not a matter of altruism or charity. It's a matter of addressing systemic injustice and our complicity in it. And in treating these issues as matters of charity, effective altruists, despite their taking the moral high ground, are in fact downplaying how urgent they are and letting themselves and us off the moral hook. So what's the alternative? Okay, I'm going to say something briefly about this, and you can ask me more about it. Suppose we go back to the intuition of neutrality. And suppose you're thinking, I agree that the repugnant conclusion is repugnant. This world in which there are trillions and trillions and trillions of people living blah lives is not better than a world in which a few billion people survive for generations on Earth living wonderful lives. Still, you may have doubts about neutrality itself. If we're in favor of making people happy, but we're neutral about making happy people, making there be more people, that suggests we should be kind of neutral about a future in which humanity goes extinct and a future in which we survive for many generations and thrive. And that doesn't seem right. We should care about the survival of humanity. The question is, why? Why care about the survival of humanity? And it's important to see that there are at least two very, very different answers to this question. One way the future of humanity could matter is because something like the total view is true, and the value of the future is a function of total aggregate welfare. So the more people there are, so long as they have positive welfare, the better. On that way of thinking about why it matters that we survive, the issue is really fundamentally about numbers, not history. It doesn't really matter from this point of view, although it's called, McCaskill's view is called long-termist. Actually, it just doesn't matter from his point of view whether people exist in the future or the immediate present. It will be equally good if we, multiplied our population by 1,000 for one generation and then all died out, than if we survived for another 1,000,000 years on this approach. Here's a very different way of thinking about why the survival of humanity matters, on which it really is about history, not numbers. So the alternative view is that we should care not about the number of human lives, but the continuation of the human story. That's in part a matter of preservation, that humanity matters. We should want humanity collectively to go on, but mere survival is not enough. When we look at the shape of history, we can see that humanity has unfinished business. Think about the injustice of the world, our ignorance, our untapped creativity, our inhibited capacity for love. Though it's hard to translate this into moral mathematics, for human life to end as it currently is would be, in a sense, that's not just metaphorical, premature. Now, I think it's very hard to translate this alternative view into moral mathematics, but it's a better view, I think, of why the long-term future matters. It has more to do with respect for humanity and the fight against injustice than it does with altruism or philanthropic giving. We should be thinking less about how the ultra-rich can save us and more about the systemic causes of inequality that give some human beings vast power over the present and the future, while others have almost none. I think capitalism, to take the long view, has driven extraordinary economic growth, it's lifted millions out of poverty, but its trajectory is unsustainable, and it's unsustainable both in planetary terms, since growth has been fueled by the externalization of environmental costs that we're only beginning to reckon with. And it's also unsustainable in human terms, since there's reason to fear that without serious intervention, the pressure of capital towards the automation of industry for profit is going to leave billions of human beings destitute. In an essay on the concept of history, the Frankfurt School philosopher Walter Benjamin refused to portray the past in progressive terms. It appears to what he called the angel of history as a single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing that propels him into the future. This storm is what we call progress. And in his notes for the essay on history, Benjamin employed another apt analogy, not the storm, but the steam engine. Marx says that revolutions are the locomotive of world history, but perhaps it is quite otherwise. Perhaps revolutions are an attempt by the passengers on the train, the human race, to activate the emergency brake. Our task now is to pull the emergency brake on climate change, along with the injustice, domestic and global, gendered and racial, with which it is entwined, and the economic system that fuels it. If we live at the hinge of history, as effective altruist long-termists like McCaskill say, let's focus our efforts on the future of this planet, not a fantasy of technological escape, a slash and burn approach to planetary occupation that is not just unrealistic, but repeats the mistakes of the past. Thank you. There we go.
Kieran, thank you. This is George. That was really very instructive and very important. Thank you for leading us through that excellent presentation and giving us the background that you did. I think I wanted to start the conversation with a couple of questions, and for anyone out there, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll monitor the chat and see if we can get questions coming from the crowd. But I wanted to start with the big news, the spectacular collapse of FTX and the failure of its founder, Sam Bankman-Fried. Sam became an advocate of effective altruism at Princeton, as I understand it, and then he made the decision to make as much money as he could in the financial markets so that he would have more to give to altruistic purposes. Kind of a Robin Hood philosophy. You know, you gather what you can, you gather much as you can, and you give it to altruistic purposes. And this leads to the question, how should we factor in the ethics of wealth accumulation over time? And the fact that the money that is accumulated has to come from somewhere. And making a lot of money has societal impacts. So how do we factor in the societal impacts of making a lot of money with the societal benefits of then turning around and distributing that money? And I think this goes to the question that you were pointing to about making decisions about where societal resources are actually deployed.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. In fact, lots of questions to address there. I'm going to start with the issue of fraud, because I think the issue with Sam Bankman-Fried is not just that he made a lot of money through this cryptocurrency exchange, but he's alleged to have defrauded the investors and who gave them money to buy cryptocurrency through the exchange. And there is a concern that effective altruism would sort of support that kind of fraud. The thought would be, well, if it's for the greater good, go ahead and do it. Now, what effective altruists will say, I think completely fairly, is we're not necessarily utilitarians. Utilitarians might say the end justifies the means. If you get aggregate welfare by defrauding people, go ahead. But as effective altruists, we allow for the idea that there are rights you shouldn't violate. And we think Sam Bankman-Fried may well have violated people's rights by defrauding them to make money, allegedly, or if this was in fact his intent, for the greater good. So I think that's a fair point for effective altruists to make about the letter of their view. I don't think, however, that the effective altruist movement is really off the moral hook. I think if I were an effective altruist, it would not be lost on me that many of the people around me are utilitarians, and that if you're a utilitarian, you don't just think, hey, the end justifies the means when it comes to killing people, and if you can get away with it, because you probably can't get away with it. You also think that lying or fraud or deception or other kinds of common sense moral injunctions don't apply to you. And even if I said, well, that's not the effective altruist position, I would think I'm dealing with people who might well hold that view, and I should factor into my dealings with them that they hold, that they might behave in those ways. And so I think there really was something very naive about effective altruists like Will MacAskill. I think it was actually at MIT that Sam Bankman-Fried was converted to effective altruism by Will MacAskill. And I think it's very naive for people in the effective altruist movement not to anticipate that others they're interacting with might be unscrupulous, given that they are, a hop, skip, and a jump from a moral philosophy that positively supports unscrupulous behavior, namely utilitarianism. Okay, that's about the fraud and effective altruism. I think even if you set aside the issue of fraud, I think you're right to sort of draw attention to this question about wealth accumulation. One of the problems with the effective altruist strategy of encouraging people to, as it were, earn to give, namely take a job with an investment bank, make a lot of money, give a lot of it to effective altruist causes, is that it tends to ignore structural political questions about the political economy questions about where that money is coming from and how the economy is structured to concentrate it in the hands of relatively few people. So in encouraging people to make money in that way, I think they're ignoring the kind of concerns that we should be moved by about complicity with unjust structures. Now, what you really wanted me to say, I think, was something more positive. So, what is the right approach here? And I don't have a worked out view in political philosophy. I do think the starting point should be that the inequalities of wealth generated by capitalism in its contemporary form are, if not unjust in themselves, sources of inequality in social and political power. And those inequalities of social and political power are, I think, almost certainly unjust. That's something EA philanthropy won't address. So I think, in a way, the although I don't have an answer to how we should reorganize the economy so that the accumulation of wealth works differently. I think the question we should be asking is not the effective altruist question of how the wealthy can direct their money, but the question, how can we reorganize the distribution of wealth so that power is not concentrated in the ways it currently is in the hands of relatively few, without thereby massively diminishing people's quality of life. So without sort of ignoring the benefits that the kind of capitalist economy has historically accrued. So yeah, that was an answer that was more criticism of effective altruism than a positive solution. But I do think this is the kind of question that's being pushed out of view by the predominance of the effective altruist version of long-termism.
Thanks. I want to go back to kind of this question about the long-termism as a rational calculus, where you're balancing. You've got the future values and effective values, and you figure out what's the best action. And one of the things that I haven't been able to get clear on is how does long-termism really look at the question of suffering and the counterpoint being thriving? And, are those linear functions? Are they non-linear? Or is, how do you factor in there's certain types of suffering that are much, 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 much worse, even though someone might survive. And then there are aspects of thriving that, that seem to be well worth more than simple account of a single life.
I think it's very difficult. I think the first thing to say is that I don't think anyone really knows how to do the math in a way that would answer those questions. I think one of the temptations of effective altruism is thereby to say, well, let's pretend that those complications don't exist and do the math on simpler assumptions. And I think that's definitely a mistake. One way I would like to reorient the discussion is to say, look, if we start by thinking that before we get to the question of sort of charitable or altruistic giving, we first got to deal with the injustice of the world. And injustice comes before altruism. That's the starting point. And what we need is a measure of how urgent and grave injustices are before we start worrying about exactly how to promote well-being in a world where the profound injustices of the present have been addressed. And if we think in those terms, I don't think there's a general answer, but I think in specific cases, we can sort of assemble a kind of, we can construct a measure that looks relatively reliable. So, I mean, in the case of climate change, although it's not of intrinsic significance, looking at the degrees of warming, whether it's 1.5 or 1.6 or 1.7, gives us a metric that is relatively straightforward to grasp and measures the extent of the harm and the injustice that's being done. When it comes to the distribution of that, like thinking about how adaptation to climate change should be structured so that those who are worst off are not impacted more severely, I just don't think that there's going to be a mathematical answer to that. I think the answer to those questions are and should proceed through sort of broadly democratic deliberations. So it should be a matter of good faith negotiation of the kind that did happen at the Paris Agreement, did happen at COP27, could be improved upon. But I don't think this is a case where philosophers come up with an a priori metric that tells you how to answer these questions. What happens is that actual agents in a negotiation trying to address a kind of problem of injustice have to think, okay, given our competing concerns, what can we realistically agree on as a measure that would make incremental progress? This is part of there's a very big kind of background debate in political philosophy between what gets called ideal and non-ideal theory. And ideal theorists say, start with a vision of perfect justice and then try and sort of get from the present to there. And I think very often we're not in a position to do that. What we're in a position to do is identify concrete injustice and think about concrete ways in which particular injustices can then be addressed. And yeah, it just isn't going to lend itself to a kind of armchair answer. So this is partly a kind of an argument for
That's
not
tough.
directly answering that
Yeah.
kind of question in
Yeah.
the way that the sort of effective altruists invite you to do.
Yeah, tough question, and I think you did really well with it, and it actually links to a comment in the chat about the fact that we're embedded in this system, this capitalist system, and it's kind of says, well, how do we make decisions within this system? And I think part of what you're pointing out is that we have to pay attention to justice issues in this system, because that is an alleviation of suffering, the suffering that happens when there are injustices. And we can't simply let that pass away, which seems to be where the effective altruists are kind of letting that slide away.
That's the thought. They're not grasping the urgency of that. And I mean, the answer to the question, what do you do about injustice and conditions of capitalism, is collective action at every scale. So they're certainly voting for policies that will mitigate injustice is one thing, but we're all also part of collectives that, at work, at school, in our local communities, and all of these problems are collectively caused, and they're all problems that are only going to be addressed by collective engagement. So I think both from the point of view of practice and from the point of view of kind of coping emotionally with the challenges of injustice in the world, finding collectives you can join, finding collectives that you can be part of, can make change, together with others at levels, at scales that you can actually see the impact, is one kind of way to engage in sort of combating injustice under the kinds of conditions of pervasive injustice we live under. But I don't, the fact is we are under those conditions. I think that's true, and I don't think the answer is to sort of the effective altruist answer of not directly addressing them doesn't seem like the right way to go.
Now this of course goes back to the quote we picked for your book.
Yes.
Right, Aristotle, man is a political animal, because everything you've just described is essentially the political processes that we are going to need to implement to make those changes.
Right. I mean, there's a kind of, if you were going to make the case for effective altruism, I suppose it would be on the thought that it's just an utterly pragmatic, fatalistic concession to the idea that systemic change is impossible. So we might as well, work within the capitalist system without trying to change it at all. But I'm not so pessimistic. I think I have more hope for politics than that kind of fatalism suggests.
Yeah, and that gets to another thing about effective altruism, is it seems to build on this idea that existing institutions and governments are largely ineffective. So, better for a wealthy donor to do their own research and make their own decisions and go off and pay for those. But that means they're focusing on things that tend to be the low-hanging fruit or easy to do, and also things that are easily measured. But isn't it true that most of our societal problems they're not easy to measure, and there isn't any simple way forward. So it's one thing to say, I'm an effective altruist and I'm giving this money to do these things that are relatively easy and not pay attention to the things that are really hard. So we need to pay attention to the hard things too.
I think that's right. I mean, I will, having been polemical, and I'm about to be polemical again about effective altruism, but I think, in fact, often what effective altruists push is that what they push are non-obvious interventions. So often one of their arguments is the low-hanging fruit are already being covered by existing institutions. The marginal benefits there have diminished, so we should try and pick out their things. And so some of the quirkiness of the effective altruist agenda is sometimes comes from the thought, what the things we're not thinking about are the ones where the smallest, you can make the biggest difference with the smallest input. I think that doesn't really answer your main concern, which is about the way in which there's two things. One is that there's a tendency to focus on policy decisions or decisions in general where the outcomes can be readily quantified, and to avoid cases where quantification is difficult. And the other is that the assessments that effective altruists make are often worryingly amateur. So again, polemical. Will MacAskill's book lists dozens and dozens of people he consulted and makes a great show of the enormous amount of research that went into it. But one of the points in the book that I was alarmed by was in the discussion of climate change, where he suggests that at 15 degrees of warming, it would still be possible for agriculture to occur somewhere on the planet, so we probably would survive. And when you look at what people who work on climate change say about the effects of 6 degrees of warming, in the accelerated timeframes we're concerned with, they suggest that there will be, methane hydrate clouds floating over the earth, causing drifting firestorms, and that's at 6 degrees. So the oceans would be anoxic. All marine life would die, pretty much. There was a grave discrepancy between what people I know in the climate community say about climate change and the kinds of things that MacAskill is saying. He cites one study, and there was a recent article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in which Emil Torres chased up all of the scientists who MacAskill cites, and in particular all of the climate scientists, and says, did he ever talk to you about this we'd survive 15 degrees claim? And if so, what did you say about it? And none of them said they had in fact been consulted about that claim, and all of them said that they thought MacAskill's conjectures about it were unscientific. So I think there is a real danger that much as institutions can be flawed and governments can be creaky in their operations and slow and inefficient, there are huge dangers in ignoring communities of experts in order to sort of make one's own evaluations. Do your own research in the kind of slogan of this kind of rationalist community. And if effective altruism and long-termism were just a little academic movement, this probably wouldn't matter very much. But when they have the ear of billionaires and they're spending $400 million a year that could be spent on other things, I think it's really, really dangerous.
I wanted to ask a question, but also it was referenced in the chat about how long-termism would approach, particularly in the age of CRISPR and gene editing and designer babies, that whole controversy. What would be the thought here about really eugenics? All right, we have to weed out certain aspects of the human DNA, and we've got to promote other aspects of the human DNA, and so that would seem to be a very easy thing to justify on the basis of long-termist arguments. And so your thoughts about that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have every reason to fear, every kind of historical reason to fear that eugenic projects will exacerbate injustice. I mean, in the worst case, by supporting and fostering movements towards genocide, but in the best case, even in the best case scenario, by increasing inequality. So I think when we think in terms of justice rather than the promotion of aggregate welfare, it's very unclear how much of what kind of case there is for eugenics. I mean, treating genetic illnesses is a very different thing from this. I want to risk a kind of coming out as a kind of neo-Luddite, but I mean, in general, when people talk about these kinds of advances, I think the fundamental problems we face right now are not primarily technological. And we need new technologies to deal, for instance, with climate change. But our fundamental problems, and the reason why we're dealing with climate change to the extent that we are, has to do with political and social failure. So the idea that some kind of technology, whether it's CRISPR gene editing or direct air carbon capture, is going to sweep along and rescue the status quo, strikes me as not just unrealistic, but sort of unresponsive, excuse me, to the to the causes of the kind of crises that make life right now seem so precarious, that have put us at the hinge of history. So yeah, I maybe if you were an effective altruist, you would have to seriously worry about the case for eugenics on grounds of aggregate welfare. But I think once you reframe things so that justice is the primary concern, there are no concerns of justice that are being addressed by the kind of eugenic adjustments whereby we make super intelligent babies. That you know, as I said, treating genetic illnesses is a different matter, because we might be addressing issues of injustice and unfairness in people's life prospects.
And yeah, I just made the connection. You mentioned genocide in that context, and I realized if we have to expand our ethical considerations beyond the present to the future, then it could become a question of genocide against peoples in the future. You know, not necessarily killing people today, but just preventing that type of human, or that that type of human from procreating in the future, because it'll be better for everybody else.
Yeah, although I would be very hesitant. I think, I would be hesitant to call that genocide, because I think we're very close then to. So one of the key things that happens in the effective altruist long-termist mindset is the idea that failing to bring people into existence is just as bad as causing the equivalent amount of harm. That when you do these aggregate welfare calculations, reducing the aggregate welfare by
We lost
on a
your.
par.
Oh.
Sorry.
So we lost your voice for a second.
It's exactly on a par with reducing the aggregate welfare by failing to cause one more person to exist. That's the mindset you get into when you think in terms of the total view and deny the intuition of neutrality. I actually think by doing things that mean that there won't be people in the future, if we're not killing those people, it's not really genocide. The issue is about the killing of actual people rather than the preventing them coming into existence. And it's the conflation of killing with preventing from coming into existence that allows effective altruists who are long-termists like McCaskill to generate these wild conclusions whereby tiny risks of extinction come to be treated as if they were tiny risks of genocide. Tiny risk of genocide would be very serious. A tiny risk of extinction is really not at all like that.
So if you look at the long-termist formulation of a rational calculus, and you look, you mentioned this in your Boston Review article about, you got to look at the axioms. What are the axioms that you think have to be added? I think you've already touched upon some, but what do you think the axioms are that have to be added to make this more acceptable?
Well, so the truth is, I wouldn't be inclined to think of it myself as a case of just taking a kind of system of axioms and adding to it, and thereby ending up with a coherent moral view. Partly because I'm thinking, look, here are three reasons for that. One is, here's an axiom, the intuition of neutrality. The idea that in itself, the number of human beings we create in the future is not, there's no particular reason to make there be more people rather than fewer people. I think that let's have that as an axiom. The problem is, the reason why people are attracted to the total view in the way McCaskill is that it's very hard to come up with a mathematical system for evaluating outcomes that incorporates that axiom. And I think, well, too bad. Sometimes the ethical truth is hard to mathematize. I don't think the right conclusion is to say, let's change our ethical views to make the math easier. So I would say there's an axiom, but I don't think it's going to lend itself to the construction of the kind of algorithmic ethical vision that effective altruists like McCaskill want. The second thing I would say is, as an axiom, it will be the priority of justice over altruism. It will be the thought that addressing injustice and not unjustly causing harm is a more urgent moral priority than just making people better off. Making people better off is good and important, but it's much more urgent when those people are badly off because of a history of colonial exploitation or because of climate chaos for which we are collectively responsible. So the thought will be prioritize the issues where justice is at stake over mere altruism or charity. And then the third thing I would say about my hesitation about complete moral systems is I think that this goes back to the ideal theory utopia issue. I think we're in much better ethical shape right now to identify injustice, to agree that it's unjust for us to collectively cause harm to others in the way climate change is doing. Much easier to identify injustice like that than to describe what a just society would be like. I don't have a blueprint for what a just world order would be. I wish I did, but to be honest, it wouldn't be much use right now because right now, the urgent questions are, how do we tackle the urgent injustice we're facing so as to give ourselves a chance of being around to fashion more just world orders in the future.
I have one more question that I want
Sure.
to ask, and then I think it's getting to the point where we'll open it up for general conversation. We've had a great exchanges going on in the chat. I think some people are sharing ideas across that menu, which is great. So here's my question. Some of us who call themselves, long nowers, part of the long now perspective of encouraging long-term thinking, encouraging the deep time, deep history, bringing that into our consciousness so that we can be more aware of how to be more effective in the future. So we share some of maybe the aspirations, I would say, of effective altruism and long-termism. And we have a slogan that we've used sometimes to say, we want to be, how do we be better ancestors? So, what should we be thinking about how our descendants will view us, and will they view us positively or will they view us negatively? And we want to be good ancestors. So just take a crack at that and see if you can help us figure out what that means.
I will say that I really like that formulation for several reasons. One is that it emphasizes that your framing emphasizes history as much as the future. I think effective altruists, long-termists, again, tend to look entirely forward. Whereas I think once we start thinking about learning from history and how that will inform how we shape the future, we're already in the kind of perspective on why the future of humanity matters that I was pushing for. Namely, it's not about more people better, the numbers count. It's that the shape of human history matters, and we want to bend the arc of human history toward justice. That's the long-term goal, and how to do that depends on an understanding of historical and social change, and is a kind of inherently historical, time-structured project. It's not just max out welfare. And the second thing I really like about the good ancestor formulation is that it's very much in sympathy with the intuition of neutrality as opposed to the total view. The picture is, assuming that there are going to be descendants, we want them to look back and say, yeah, they didn't cause us harm, and they didn't leave us a depleted, dangerous world. They put us in a position where we can flourish. They didn't put us in a terrible position. But of course, that's a very different from goal. Wanting to be a good ancestor is sort of conditional on there being descendants. I want those descendants to recognize that I did right by them. It's very different to say, I want to be an ancestor to as many as possible, or it's really important that everyone be ancestors for as many generations as can be, which is the kind of framing that would be more quantitative and will make it seem like the goal is just to make sure you have descendants, as opposed to caring that given that you're going to have descendants, the world you leave them is one that is not one that they don't deserve to live in.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you. Kim, do you want to make the transition now to open the floor? Turn your mic on. There we go. Kim is still muted. All right. Well, now he's on spotlight, but his microphone is not working. Okay, we have let me take a little, yeah, okay. So as Kim was about to say, we have a tradition after a
Can you hear me now?
presentation. Yes,
Oh.
we can. You want to take over? Okay. Go ahead, Kim.
You take it, George.
All right, I'll just finish. We have a tradition to head to the bar after we close our event, the formal part of our event, and continue the conversation with the group at large. So we're about to do that, but first, a big thank you to Kieran for this incredible conversation. And thanks to our hardworking team of Gary, Mary, Kim, Anurag, myself, and Kieran, a round of applause for a great presentation. It was really, really wonderful.